I'm sure everyone has heard the reports of the Bulls strongly considering going into a rebuild mid-season. And while I'm not completely convinced this is going to fully take place before the trade deadline, there's still some interesting developments going on that I feel like are worth noting. There's no real trade market right now because most teams are still kind of getting situated in the season and kind of evaluating their teams. So while it is true that from late December to about early February, that's going to be the time when the Bulls are shopping their players the most, there's still a little bit of buzz about this potential rebuild right now. And what's been particularly interesting is that there's been some reports that Alex Caruso has actually been demanding more attention than both LaVine and DeRozan. So at first glance when I read this, I thought this was ridiculous, but when I actually thought about it for a second, it actually made a lot of sense, regardless of if these reports are true or not. So before I get into what I think Caruso's value is and what team should get him, I first want to focus on why LaVine and DeRozan are not as valuable as you may think. So, starting with DeRozan. DeRozan's 34. He has 1 year left on his contract. He's making $28.5 million. So, the problem already is that he only has 1 year left on his contract, and then he's just a free agent. So, any contending team doesn't want to invest all that into a player that may just end up leaving in free agency. Also, on the other hand, for contending teams, most contending teams are already battling the cap. As is. So trying to bring in DeRozan at $28.5 million is going to take a lot for that to salary match. Now, the difference for Zach LaVine is that he's under contract for the next 3 years with a player option after that, and he's also only 28. Teams would be a lot less reluctant to trade for LaVine because they know he's going to be there long term, whereas with DeMar DeRozan, he can leave if he wanted in the offseason. Another problem with trading LaVine is that he's making a max contract now, which may be a little bit of an overpay, but even besides that, like I said with DeRozan, it's going to take a lot for a contending team to match that contract if they're already fighting the cap as is. Now, a problem that both LaVine and DeRozan share, and kind of getting more into the Caruso section of the video, is that both LaVine and DeRozan are not going to fit as well into a contending team as Caruso would, in my opinion. And this is because LaVine and DeRozan are just high-volume scorers. You're going to get the most out of LaVine and DeRozan if you give them the ball and you give them shots. You know, neither of them are very good defenders. Neither of them are very good passers. They're not terrific rebounders. They don't do a lot of necessarily small things. They're very good at scoring, and to score, you're going to need the ball a lot, at least with their play style. So if a contending team were to trade for either LaVine or DeRozan, there's two ways they can get hurt by this. If they want to make them the third option, let's say, you're not really getting the most out of them because, like I said, they're going to be at their most productive when they're taking a lot of shots and getting the ball in their hands all the time. But on the other hand, if you want to make them the second option or like a 1B option, you're putting a lot of risk into these players mid-season when you don't really know how they're going to fit in and you're not going to have an entire offseason and training camp to incorporate them into the team. Now, DeRozan at $28.5 million a year as a third option can make sense financially, but LaVine at a max contract being a third option is just going to be an overpay for his services at that point. Another thing to note is that for truly win-now or contending teams, historically, doing a big trade and a big shakeup of your roster at the trade deadline has not been successful. So if we look at the recent champions, for example, none of them had any big moves at the trade deadline. So the Nuggets didn't last year, the Warriors didn't before that, the Bucks didn't before that, the Lakers didn't before that, the Raptors didn't before that, the Warriors didn't before that, and so on and so forth. So in regards to that aspect of the situation, it's not that important to DeRozan because he only has 1 year left regardless. But as for LaVine, I think he'd probably fetch more value from an up-and-coming team rather than a contending team because it's hard to fit in a max contract player in the middle of the season and expect it to work perfectly. So I'm not going to go into that idea any further because this video is more so about Alex Caruso and narrowing down which teams I think make the most sense for him to get traded to because I do think that he's more likely to be traded because he's only making $10 million and he's going to be easier to fit into a contender. But as for Caruso, I wanted to focus on why I think he's so valuable before I get into narrowing down his trade destinations. And the reason why I think he's so valuable is because he's in the opposite situation as LaVine and DeRozan. He's only 29, he's making $10 million a year for the next 2 years, and he's going to be a lot easier to plug and play into other contenders. And that's because he's just not someone that needs the ball on offense a lot. And this isn't because Caruso is some offensive menace. It's really just because he's a catch and shoot player. There's not much to his offensive game after that. And of course, it's nice to be better at offense, than that. But at $10 million and still young, that's certainly a lot easier to get, and there's a lot less to risk rather than getting LaVine at a max contract. But aside from that, of course, Alex Caruso is a terrific defender, and I think this is particularly valuable to contenders. And this is because great perimeter defenders coming off the bench has become a bit of a norm for new contenders in the league. So, for example, the Lakers have Jared Vanderbilt, the Timberwolves have McDaniels, and the Celtics, as soon as they traded Marcus Smart, they replaced him with Drew Holiday. You could also look at recent champions, and it's become more obvious that great perimeter defenders, even if they're coming off the bench, have become more prevalent. So, for example, you have Bruce Brown coming off the bench in last year's playoffs. Before that, you had Gary Payton II coming in for the Warriors. And even before that with the Bucks, there were a lot of games in that 2021 playoffs where Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton were doing awful on offense, but they were doing so great on defense that it was able to make up the difference. But on to narrowing down the trade destinations. To better conceptualize this, I created a tier list of every team in the NBA except for the Bulls. And I ended up with 5 tiers, and I put each team in each tier that best summarized their position on potentially getting Alex Caruso. So at the bottom tier, I just have rebuilding teams. So that was the Blazers, the Hornets, the Pistons, the Wizards, the Spurs, and the Jazz. They're not really looking for a Caruso type, ceiling raiser. They need floor raisers right now, if anything. After that, I had kind of just like a neutral tier, and these are mostly kind of up-and-coming teams or kind of like young teams that aren't necessarily rebuilding, but they're in a weird spot. This is kind of a weird tier, but I have the Thunder, the Magic, the Nets, the Pacers, the Kings, the Grizzlies, and the Raptors. Now, all of these are young teams, so, some of these teams are trying to win for sure, but they're not necessarily, like, in win-now mode, like some of the teams above them. I'm sure that, some of these teams would like Caruso, but I feel like the teams above them are going to be more desperate and therefore are going to offer more for them. So, after the neutral tier, I had the need more than Caruso tier, and this is basically a bunch of teams that have been making the playoffs recently and kind of not broken through yet. And they're not really in that up-and-coming tier either, I would say. So we have the Hawks, for example. We have the Rockets. We have the Cavaliers. We have the Pelicans. We have the Knicks. And we also have the Warriors. And really with all these teams, even if they were to get Caruso for just something like a second rounder or something, I don't see Caruso pushing the needle for them into like contending status. So these teams aren't necessarily, they're not rebuilding, they're not necessarily like young and upcoming, they're kind of in the middle right now. So I don't feel like Caruso is best there, but I'm sure that all these teams would be interested in him. Now after that tier, I have the want Caruso tier, and every team on that tier is in win now mode. But with this tier, Caruso is more of a luxury than a necessity. This is because most of these teams already have a Caruso-type player, or they already just have great perimeter defense. There's also some teams here that just don't really have the assets to get into this trade market. So starting with like the Timberwolves, they have McDaniels. The Heat have never had a problem with perimeter defense. The Lakers have Vanderbilt coming off the bench. The Celtics have Drew Holiday. And then the Suns and the Clippers just don't have a lot of assets to play with, so I think they're just going to get outbid. But all these teams, are win now, and they would love a ceiling raiser like Alex Caruso. It's just that they already have players that kind of fill his role for the most part. And then the final tier is the need Caruso tier. And these are all win-now teams that I think need a bit of an upgrade for their perimeter defense. And this consists of the Sixers, the Bucks, and the Mavericks. Starting with the Sixers, I think that their perimeter defense has been kind of an oversight in the past year. So everyone's been talking about this year that, they've upgraded to coaching and they've gotten rid of Harden. Their perimeter defense is still not that good, in my opinion, for a contender. So obviously in the past, at one point they had Matisse Thybulle and Ben Simmons playing, and they had terrific perimeter defense then. But even in last year's playoffs, it became obvious that their perimeter defense was just lacking because, they had Maxey, Harden, and DeAnthony Melton and Tobias Harris trying to guard the perimeter. And most of those defenders are either just, not good defenders or just average defenders or above average defenders. Right now, they have really Maxey, Oubre, and D'Anthony Melton and Tobias Harris on the perimeter. And that's just, okay. I guess Melton is probably the best defender out of all of them. But I think that they're going to need a little bit more than that after, seeing what the Celtics were able to do in the last playoffs. I think they need an Alex Caruso. Now, as for the Bucks, I think this kind of goes back to their offseason move where they got Damian Lillard in place of Drew Holiday, and there was some chatting about, their perimeter defense is going to be a lot worse now, and I think that Caruso can kind of patch up those worries for people that are worried about that. And another aspect to the Bucks defense that I don't think people are kind of looking at right now is, what the deal is with Chris Middleton. I think I'm going to make my own video about that, but I am a bit worried about Chris Middleton's health down the line and his ability to play defense because he's been having a lot of problems with his knees, and we've seen, like with Klay Thompson, for example, when you start getting riddled by injuries, the defense is the first to go. And then lastly, with the Mavericks, no one's really worried about the Mavericks offense being bad. Everyone's kind of holding their breath about their defense, and I think that they definitely need Caruso probably the most out of anyone on this tier to really get their perimeter defense up to standard for a contender at least. But looking at the entire tier list now, I can see Caruso realistically going to most of these teams that are in the neutral tier or above. And that's just because, like I said, he can plug and play anywhere. And I think any team that's in win now or is gearing up to getting to win now mode is going to want Caruso. So we'll see what happens. I think this top tier of the Sixers, Bucks, and Mavericks is where we can see Caruso have the biggest impact. But like I said, he realistically could go to like a dozen or more teams, and I wouldn't be shocked. So while I do think it's very likely that Caruso gets traded, as for LaVine and DeRozan, I think it's a bit less unlikely, but I may make a video on that. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Comment something if you have something to say. And thank y'all for watching. I guess I'll see y'all next time.